There comes a moment in your life when you stop chasing noisy, and you start listening to silence. It is in that silence, not filled by touch, distraction, or validation, that your soul begins to whisper truths that were always there, waiting for you. The modern world encourages stimulation. It teaches us that fulfillment comes from consumption, of food, of media, of relationships, of sensation. But what if I told you that real clarity does not come from having more, but from needing less? The truth behind abstinence is not about denying life. It is about reclaiming it. When the body goes silent, not because it's neglected, but because it is honored with discipline, the soul begins to speak, and what it says may surprise you. It does not speak in the language of fear or longing. It speaks in clarity. It says you are whole, you are enough, and you do not need to grasp to be grounded. So let us walk together into the quiet space where the soul begins to emerge, not louder, but deeper. Not to escape the world, but to engage with it from a place of calm authority. Because when the body is no longer in control, the master awakens within. When we speak of abstinence, most people immediately interpret it as restriction, something removed, something withheld. But in the deeper traditions, especially within Eastern philosophy and contemplative practice, abstinence is not about lack. It is about listening. It is about learning to perceive what has always been present, but hidden beneath noise. The body, with its desires, its instincts, its cravings, is not wrong. But it is also not the whole picture. And when the body becomes quiet, not forced into silence, but gently, consciously quieted through intentional abstinence, another voice emerges, the voice of the soul. In a world that is constantly asking us to react, to pursue, to indulge, this silence can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. But discomfort is often the doorway to transformation. The first principle in mastering the path of abstinence is the understanding that stillness invites self-realization. Without the stillness that abstinence can provide, we may continue to operate from conditioning, reacting to life rather than consciously participating in it. Consider the way water becomes clear. When it is stirred, it is murky. But when it is allowed to settle, it becomes transparent. Our inner world functions in much the same way. The constant stimulation of the body, through sensory pleasures, instant gratification, and external validation, keeps our emotional and mental waters disturbed. In this state, it is very difficult to see ourselves clearly. But when we intentionally withdraw from that overstimulation, the sediment begins to settle. And in that inner stillness, something extraordinary happens. We begin to see. It is not uncommon for individuals who take periods of abstinence, whether from sexual intimacy, excessive social interaction, digital engagement, or even food, to report an increased sensitivity to their inner life. They begin to notice subtle emotions that previously passed unnoticed. They observe patterns in their thoughts. They see their relationships through a different lens. This is the soul speaking, not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet, persistent whispers. And it only becomes audible when the noise of the body softens. From a psychological perspective, this aligns with the principle of sensory adaptation. When the brain is constantly bombarded with stimulation, it begins to dull its response to that stimulus. This is why people become desensitized to pleasure, to beauty, even to love. But when the stimuli are withdrawn, the nervous system resets. What was once overlooked becomes precious again. This is one of the hidden gifts of abstinence. It renews our capacity to appreciate, to feel, to be deeply present. There is a story told in the Taoist tradition of a young disciple who went into solitude under the guidance of his master. For many days, he fasted, meditated, and refrained from all interaction. When he finally returned, his fellow disciples asked him what he had learned. He replied, "Before, I saw the mountain. Then I saw only dust. Now I see the mountain again, but it breathes." What he meant was simple, yet profound. Abstinence had stripped away the projections of his mind. The mountain had become real to him again. Not a concept, not a background object, but a living presence. This is how abstinence restores relationship, not only to people, but to life itself. When we step back, we start to see again. The implications of this for relationships are enormous. In the absence of physical closeness, emotional patterns surface. We begin to recognize whether we are drawn to someone from our soul or from a wound, whether our connection is rooted in shared purpose or in the avoidance of loneliness. Abstinence gives us the space to observe these dynamics without the chemical influence of oxytocin and dopamine clouding our clarity. The absence of physical intimacy can reveal the presence, or absence, of emotional and spiritual resonance. In this way, abstinence is not separation, it is revelation. It is through this practice that we train ourselves to stop confusing intensity with intimacy. Many people equate passion with connection, but passion, when not grounded, can be purely reactive. It can be a response to trauma, to unmet needs, to unhealed wounds. True intimacy, on the other hand, emerges when both people can be fully present, not as extensions of each other's cravings, but as mirrors of each other's essence. And so we return to the silence of the body, not as punishment, but as practice. A practice of seeing without touching, of listening without reacting, of being without needing. In this stillness, we become less reactive and more reflective. We begin to notice not only what we want, but why we want it. And often, this awareness reveals that our desires were not truly ours. They were inherited, copied, or born from fear. When the body goes silent, the soul begins to reintroduce us to ourselves. There is another layer to this that comes from neuroscience. When the brain is in a state of craving or stimulation, it activates the limbic system, the seat of emotional urgency and immediate gratification. This system is essential for survival, but it is not wise. It does not see the long arc of a meaningful life or a nourishing relationship. It sees only now. But abstinence activates the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for foresight, empathy, long-term planning, and self-regulation. In other words, abstinence literally changes the type of person we become neurologically. We shift from reactive to responsive, from impulsive to intentional, and this neurological shift translates directly into the emotional quality of our relationships. When we are ruled by the body, we often relate from need. But when the body is calm, we can relate from fullness. This is the essence of self-mastery. And it is not dry or detached. It is powerful, magnetic, and deeply peaceful. People who master this inner stillness begin to exude a presence that others can feel. Not because they are trying to impress or seduce, but because they are not trying. They are simply at peace. Which brings us to the second principle, energy transmutation. In the classic Eastern systems, particularly in Taoism and Shaolin philosophy, energy is seen as fluid and transferable. Sexual energy, or Jing, is considered a foundational life force. When dissipated without consciousness, it weakens the body and clouds the mind. But when retained and consciously transformed, it becomes Kli, the energy of vitality and presence, and ultimately Shen, or spiritual clarity. This is not metaphor. This is lived experience. Many monks and practitioners speak of how, after periods of abstinence, they feel more alive, not less. Their senses become sharper. Their intuition heightens. They experience more joy in simple things. This is the gift of transmutation, the redirecting of energy from lower expressions into higher ones. Modern science supports this ancient view. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with pleasure and motivation, operates on a principle of reward prediction. When we engage in high-reward behaviors frequently, especially artificial ones like pornography, processed food, or social media, the dopamine system becomes overstimulated. The result is desensitization. We require more and more stimulation to feel the same level of pleasure, but when we abstain, dopamine receptors reset. Pleasure returns to balance, and our capacity to feel joy in everyday life is restored. In a relationship context, this is crucial. Many couples suffer not from a lack of love, but from a lack of sensitivity. Their nervous systems are overstimulated and exhausted. Their capacity to appreciate each other is dulled. They mistake this for boredom or incompatibility. But often, the remedy is not to add more excitement. It is to remove the excess, to fast, to simplify, to pause. And in that pause, something happens. Energy that was previously scattered begins to consolidate. This is what transmutation feels like. Not the suppression of desire, but the redirection of desire. Desire that once moved outward now moves inward. It becomes creative, insightful, focused. Individuals who practice abstinence often report an increase in productivity, clarity, and creativity. Why? Because they are no longer leaking energy through constant stimulation. They are containing it and channeling it. This is a principle that can be practiced by anyone, not only monks or spiritual seekers. A woman in a long-term marriage can choose a week of emotional and physical stillness. not to punish her partner, but to listen more deeply to her own inner truth. A man recovering from heartbreak can choose to redirect his energy into building a more stable and centered version of himself. In both cases, abstinence becomes not isolation, but transformation. Let us take a simple but profound example. A young couple decides to abstain from physical intimacy for a month, not because they are forced to, but because they want to build their connection on something deeper. During that time, they journal together. They meditate in silence. They take long walks and speak of fears, dreams, and childhood wounds. In those 30 days, their bond deepens in ways that physical intimacy never could have provided alone. Why? Because they allowed their energy to be transmuted, not into urgency, but into presence, not into craving, but into communion. Abstinence is not about repression. It is about creation. And what we create when we practice it with awareness is ourselves. We shape a version of ourselves that is sovereign, not reactive, not desperate for validation, but calm, radiant, and magnetic. And from this inner state, our relationships shift. We no longer choose partners to fill our emptiness. We attract people who reflect our fullness. We stop chasing chemistry and start valuing harmony. We stop performing and start being. And this is not a distant ideal. It begins in the small choices. The decision to say no when the body says yes, but the soul says wait. The choice to be alone with discomfort rather than rush into distraction. The courage to pause when everyone else is running. These are the beginnings of transmutation, because when the body grows quiet, the soul speaks. And when we begin to listen, we don't just hear new truths, we become someone new. In many relationships, there comes a moment when the intensity begins to fade. The fire that once burned brightly starts to dim, and what remains is a quiet kind of closeness, or in some cases, a growing emptiness. Often, this shift is feared. People begin to question, do we still love each other? Is this normal? Or are we simply attached to what we used to be? This is where abstinence reveals one of its deepest truths. It helps us distinguish between emotional attachment and energetic bonding. Emotional attachment is often mistaken for love. It feels strong, sometimes overwhelming, and it convinces us that we cannot live without the other person. But this type of attachment is frequently rooted not in love, but in fear. Fear of being alone, of losing our identity, of confronting the emptiness we carry within ourselves. Energetic bonding, on the other hand, is not born from fear. It is not reactive or possessive. It is quiet, grounded, and deeply present. It does not cling, but it connects. It does not demand, but it invites. Abstinence creates the space for us to see which one we are experiencing. When we are entangled in emotional attachment, our relationship is often driven by unspoken expectations. You must respond to my text immediately, or I feel unloved. If you don't show affection the way I want, I feel insecure. These are not expressions of love, they are reactions born from unresolved wounds. But when we take time to step back, to observe rather than act, we begin to notice how much of our emotional behavior is not conscious. It is habitual. A woman once told the story of her experience after choosing to abstain from dating for 6 months. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She simply wanted to understand why all her past relationships followed the same cycle. Intense beginning, emotional dependency, painful ending. During those months, she journaled every time she felt lonely. She noticed her triggers. She remembered moments in childhood where love felt conditional. And slowly, she began to see she had not been falling in love. She had been falling into patterns. Her body responded to attention with excitement. Her mind interpreted it as connection. But beneath it all was a desire to be seen, to be worthy. This awareness didn't make her bitter. It made her free. This is the gift of pause. It gives us clarity. In many spiritual traditions, clarity is considered more valuable than love, because clarity leads to wise love, not just emotional intensity. When abstinence is practiced with presence, not as avoidance, but as inquiry, it reveals the difference between needing someone and seeing someone, and this difference changes everything. Emotional attachment says, I need you to make me feel okay. Energetic bonding says, I am okay, and I choose to share my presence with you. One is rooted in dependency, the other in sovereignty. One reacts from emptiness, the other flows from fullness. Modern psychology echoes this understanding through the concept of attachment styles. Anxious attachment seeks closeness for reassurance. Avoidant attachment pushes intimacy away out of fear. Secure attachment, however, arises when one feels whole enough not to be consumed by the relationship, yet open enough to be fully present in it. Abstinence can serve as a bridge from insecurity to security. When we are no longer intoxicated by physical or emotional stimulation, we begin to see the underlying patterns clearly. We gain insight into our own triggers, and we begin to untangle ourselves from the projections we place onto others. This is especially important in romantic relationships, where physical intimacy can often mask emotional disconnection. Two people may be physically close, yet energetically distant. Or they may be sexually compatible, but emotionally entangled in unresolved trauma. Abstinence, even temporarily, removes the veil. It asks, without the pleasure, without the distraction, without the routine, what remains between us? This question is not meant to create distance. It is meant to invite depth. There is a saying in Zen tea, when the mind is still, the heart can speak. The same is true in relationships. When the physical becomes still, through abstinence, silence, or space, the deeper truth of the relationship is revealed. Sometimes this truth is painful. It may show that the connection was based on chemistry, not compatibility. That one person was emotionally carrying the weight of both. That what felt like love was actually fear of abandonment. But other times, the truth is more beautiful than we imagined. It reveals an invisible thread of respect, kindness, and presence. A bond that is not shaken by the absence of touch or time. Energetic bonding can be felt across distances. It does not require constant affirmation. It is not threatened by space. It is a resonance between two beings who are rooted in their own presence, yet open to the shared field between them. This kind of connection deepens with silence. It is not needy, but nurturing. One young man, after ending a 3-year relationship, chose to remain single for a full year. During that time, he engaged in deep meditation, inner work, and celibacy. He noticed something extraordinary. The longing he had always felt to be completed by a partner began to dissolve, and in its place, he felt a quiet joy. He no longer approached relationships with desperation. He no longer feared rejection. He knew that he would never again lose himself to someone else's love, because he had found himself. And when he eventually entered a new relationship, it was unlike anything he had experienced. There was no chasing, no testing, no control, just presence, laughter, and a steady appreciation. He had become a man who did not need to possess love, only to participate in it. This is the shift from attachment to bonding, from fear to freedom. In energy-based traditions, everything is vibration. Emotions, thoughts, even intentions carry frequency. When we operate from emotional attachment, our vibration is often erratic, driven by fear, overthinking, and control. We are constantly looking outward to manage the relationship, to secure our place in someone's life. But when we shift into energetic bonding, our vibration becomes steady. We radiate peace. We no longer chase connection, we become connection. And this shift is often catalyzed through abstinence. When the usual patterns of engagement are paused, energy consolidates. This is what is called withdrawing the senses in yogic philosophy. Pratyahara. It is not suppression, it is refinement. When the energy is not being poured out through compulsive speech, physical intimacy, or emotional reactivity, it begins to circulate within. This circulating energy cleanses the heart. It brings us back to center. And from this center, we can relate to others with clarity and compassion. This doesn't mean we become cold or detached. On the contrary, energetic bonding is often more affectionate than attachment. Because it is not afraid. It can give without needing something in return. It can love without controlling. It can hold space for difference without feeling threatened. In relationships, this creates a new kind of atmosphere. One where both individuals feel safe to grow. Where space is not a threat, but a gift. Where love is not a transaction, but a transmission. There is a short story shared in some Eastern circles about a sage who lived in a remote village. A young man came to him one day, heartbroken, saying, "She left me. I can't live without her." The sage looked at him, smiled gently, and replied, "Then you have not loved her. You have only loved your dependency on her." The young man was confused. "But I miss her every moment," he said. "Exactly," the sage replied. "And each of those moments is showing you where you are absent from yourself." This story reveals an essential truth. Most of what we call heartbreak is not about the other person. It is about the loss of what they symbolize to us: safety, worth, identity. But when we return to ourselves through intentional stillness, we begin to meet the parts of us that were outsourced. We reclaim our own energy, and we discover that true connection begins within. Energetic bonding can only occur between two people who have made peace with their own solitude. Because otherwise, the relationship is not a communion, it is an escape. And anything used to escape the self becomes an addiction. Abstinence, when done with intention, breaks this cycle. It returns us to ourselves. It shows us where we have outsourced our self-worth. It reveals whether the love we are offering is truly free or filled with invisible contracts. Even in long-term relationships, this principle applies. A couple can choose, for a time, to refrain from physical intimacy, not out of conflict, but out of curiosity, to notice what arises, to notice how they respond to each other when touch is not the default. Sometimes, they discover irritations that had been masked by routine. Other times, they rediscover tenderness, presence, and gratitude that had been lost in the rhythm of daily life. In both cases, the truth emerges. And from that truth, the relationship can either dissolve or deepen, not based on fear, but on clarity. In practical terms, this kind of energetic clarity requires emotional discipline. It means learning to sit with discomfort rather than act on it. It means being honest with oneself about what is motivating a text, a kiss, or even a conversation. Is it coming from love, or from the fear of losing love? This kind of inquiry takes courage. It takes stillness. But it also brings freedom. Freedom from the roller coaster of emotional highs and lows. Freedom from manipulation and silent expectations. Freedom to love more deeply, because we are no longer afraid of being alone. Energetic bonding also brings discernment. It helps us see who truly resonates with our essence, and who merely fits our patterns. In a world where connections can be made in seconds, this discernment is sacred. It prevents entanglements that drain us. It protects the energy we've cultivated. It ensures that when we give ourselves, we do so not from hunger, but from fullness. This is the heart of the third principle, that abstinence is not just about withholding. It is about awakening to the truth of our connections, awakening to the difference between emotional noise and energetic harmony, awakening to the fact that love does not always mean closeness, and closeness does not always mean love. When we become still, we begin to feel the pulse of something quieter than desire, more powerful than fear, and more lasting than pleasure. That pulse is the soul speaking, and it speaks most clearly when the body is still. There is a profound silence that takes root in our lives when we begin to remove external stimulation, especially those that stir us emotionally, romantically, or physically. This silence is not just the absence of noise. It is the stillness of energy that has been recollected. In that recollection, something extraordinary happens. Our intuitive intelligence rises. Abstinence, particularly when practiced with sincerity and presence, does not only create distance from external attachment, it initiates the awakening of internal perception. This awakening is not mystical in the vague sense. It is deeply grounded in biology, psychology, and energy. It teaches us how to feel more with less, how to perceive the emotional atmosphere in a room, how to sense dissonance even when words are calm, and how to recognize when a relationship is life-giving or life-draining, without waiting for drama to make it obvious. Intuition, in many traditions, is considered the voice of the soul. But for most people, that voice is drowned out by the noise of stimulation. The constant scrolling, the text messages, the romantic highs, and the crash of emotional co-dependency all cloud our inner clarity. We are often so stimulated that we confuse reactivity with awareness. But intuition does not shout. It whispers. It needs space to be heard. Abstinence, then, is a path toward refining the senses, not dulling them. It creates the necessary quiet for subtle wisdom to rise. When the mind is no longer preoccupied with seeking validation or excitement, it starts to observe more clearly. It listens. It feels. It begins to attune itself to patterns that were previously invisible. Emotional lies, small betrayals, unspoken expectations, they all become easier to sense, not through suspicion, but through attunement. In psychological terms, this is sometimes referred to as interoception, the ability to perceive internal states. Highly intuitive people tend to be highly interoceptive. They can feel emotional shifts in their own body before they react. They can feel tension rising in someone else before a word is spoken. This is not magic. It is sensitivity matured into wisdom. And abstinence accelerates this process because it removes the energetic noise that numbs perception. There's a story of a woman in her late 40s who, after many years of heartbreak and disappointment in love, chose to take a vow of celibacy for a year, not as punishment, but as a return to herself. During that time, she stopped dating, stopped seeking attention, and began a deep process of inner reflection. She noticed that her cravings for companionship often intensified when she was emotionally overwhelmed or bored. Rather than acting on them, she sat with them. She cried. She wrote. She learned to breathe through them. Slowly, her sensitivity increased. She began to feel when someone's smile was genuine, when a compliment was a tactic, and when a connection was sincere. This clarity transformed her, not into a cynic, but into a woman who no longer confused attention with affection, or chemistry with compatibility. When the body becomes still, we stop reaching. And when we stop reaching, we start feeling. We begin to notice the deeper energy that moves through relationships. A conversation becomes more than words. A glance becomes a transmission. A silence between two people begins to say more than an entire monologue. This is not fantasy. It is what becomes available when we are no longer addicted to noise. It is often said that when a person abstains from sexual intimacy for an extended period, their other senses become heightened. This is not just metaphor. The nervous system, no longer flooded with spikes of dopamine and oxytocin from physical touch, rebalances itself. Neurochemically, abstinence reduces the overstimulation that numbs our emotional receptors. And what emerges is a subtler sensitivity, a kind of energetic listening. This is why monks, mystics, and martial artists often practice abstinence not out of repression, but to refine perception. In relationships, this perception is invaluable. It allows us to sense incongruence, to feel when someone's words say one thing, but their energy says another. It protects us from investing in people who present well but carry unresolved chaos. It helps us detect when love is becoming possession, when charm is becoming manipulation, and when distance is not about space but emotional detachment. But more than that, it helps us perceive our own energy, to know when we are centered and when we are seeking, to know when our desire to connect comes from fullness and when it arises from fear. This internal clarity is the foundation of all healthy relationships. Without it, we are constantly guessing about others and about ourselves. In Eastern philosophy, especially in Taoist and Buddhist traditions, intuition is cultivated through stillness. The practice of sitting in silence, of withdrawing from sensory engagement, is not just about discipline. It is about recalibrating the body-mind system to its natural state. In this state, the heart becomes a reliable compass, and the decisions made from this place are not reactions, they are responses. They carry weight, they carry wisdom. A man in his early 30s once shared that after a long pattern of falling into passionate but unstable relationships, he decided to take a break from dating for 6 months. He continued living normally, but without the pursuit of romance. Initially, he felt lost. Without the thrill of the chase, he didn't know what to focus on. But then something shifted. He began to notice how people spoke to each other. He noticed subtle patterns in human behavior that he had always overlooked. He realized how often he had been blind to red flags because he had been intoxicated by desire. Abstinence for him became a training ground for emotional clarity. When he finally chose to enter a new relationship, he didn't do so because he was lonely. He did so because he knew. And that knowing came from stillness, not stimulation. This kind of clarity is not only for monks or sages. It is for every person who has ever felt lost in love, who has ever questioned their instincts, or who has ever stayed too long in a relationship that drained their soul. Abstinence teaches us that our deepest wisdom is not found in others. It is revealed in the space we create within ourselves. In a world that rewards urgency and constant interaction, the act of pausing, of stepping back from desire, is revolutionary. It is a return to discernment. And this discernment is essential for relationship success. Because love is not measured by how quickly it starts, but by how deeply it roots. To develop this level of intuitive clarity requires emotional discipline. It requires sitting through the discomfort of not being touched, not being validated, not being chosen. And yet in that discomfort, we meet ourselves. We meet the part of us that is not shaped by others. We meet our unshakable center. When a person returns to that center, they no longer make decisions from scarcity. They no longer say yes out of fear or no out of pride. Their relationships become intentional. They are not chasing a feeling. They are aligning with truth. There's a famous quote from the Indian mystic Osho. If you love a flower, don't pick it up. Because if you pick it up, it dies, and it ceases to be what you love. So if you love a flower, let it be. Love is not about possession. Love is about appreciation. This is the essence of energetic clarity. When we are no longer driven by the compulsion to possess, we begin to perceive. We begin to appreciate. We begin to see people for who they are, not for how they make us feel. Abstinence clears the fog. It teaches us to appreciate without needing to own, to observe without needing to control. It sharpens our ability to read energy, to trust our inner compass, and to step away from relationships that lack reciprocity, not with bitterness, but with peace. In relationships, this level of perception also brings maturity. A mature heart does not demand constant validation. It does not panic in the absence of affection. It knows the difference between a temporary need and a timeless truth. This maturity is what builds enduring partnerships. It is what allows two people to grow together without fusing into dependency. The energetic clarity that arises from abstinence also impacts how we relate to others emotionally. We become more patient, less reactive, more grounded in our responses. When we sense misalignment, we don't panic, we observe. When we feel attraction, we don't rush, we listen. When we sense discomfort, we explore it, not escape it. This internal shift changes everything. It changes how we date, how we love, how we walk away, and how we return. It changes the quality of presence we bring into every interaction. And presence is the one thing no relationship can thrive without. When you've tasted this kind of clarity, you stop settling for chaos. You stop tolerating energy that feels heavy. You stop confusing excitement with alignment, and you begin to honor what your intuition always knew, that love is not meant to consume you. It is meant to complement you. There's a term in neuroscience called neuroception, the brain's ability to detect safety or threat without conscious thought. This primal system is always scanning, always sensing, and it is deeply affected by our emotional habits. When we are addicted to stimulation, our neuroception is skewed. We mistake intensity for intimacy, but abstinence recalibrates this system. It teaches the body what calm feels like. It restores our ability to feel safe without being stimulated. And from that place, we begin to choose differently. We choose partners who bring peace, not performance. We value depth over drama. We recognize that chemistry is only the beginning, and without clarity, it leads to confusion. Energetic clarity allows us to ask better questions. Is this person aligned with the values I hold sacred? Do I feel seen? Or am I constantly trying to be understood? Does this connection elevate my energy or exhaust it? These are not questions of the mind. They are questions of the heart. And the heart cannot answer them if it is overstimulated and uncentered. Abstinence, as a practice, returns us to the simplicity of truth. It simplifies our decisions, sharpens our perception, and deepens our connections, not just with others, but with the core of who we are. In this space of stillness, where we are no longer driven by the hunger for external validation, we begin to move differently. We no longer chase, we attract. We no longer beg, we discern. We no longer settle, we select. And what we select reflects who we've become. This is not a theory, it is lived experience. It is the fruit of inner discipline, cultivated through the silence abstinence offers. And in that silence, something beautiful happens. We remember the sound of our own soul. We remember how to trust it. And we learn how to listen again, not just to others, but to the deeper truth that speaks in stillness, the truth that has been waiting to guide us all along. There is a mysterious power that awakens when we stop trying to constantly prove our worth to the world. A power that is subtle yet unmistakable, a power that flows not from ego, but from essence. This power is known in many traditions as presence. It is the kind of presence that is not loud or forceful, but magnetic. It is not something you chase, it is something you become. And it is cultivated most deeply during seasons of intentional abstinence. When you turn your energy inward, rather than scattering it in all directions. Sexual energy is one of the most potent forces within the human system. In the Taoist and yogic traditions, it is considered sacred. It is the seed of life itself, and when it is constantly spent outwardly without intention, a person often feels drained, distracted, or emotionally fragmented. But when this energy is conserved and redirected inward, it transforms into something else: vitality, clarity, and radiant self-respect. In modern terms, this could be called energetic sovereignty. In spiritual language, it is the refinement of the inner flame. When the body is no longer being used as a tool to chase pleasure or approval, it becomes something sacred. And when the body is treated as sacred, it begins to emit a kind of quiet confidence